stage treatment. And as a whole, the healthcare system is going to need to work out approaches on these payment, on these care delivery reform issues to ensure appropriate patient access while managing healthcare costs and having a sustainable health system. So while the path ahead is not clear at this point, it's an important time to address these issues so that we can be prepared and move forward with these treatment options and their further development as effectively as possible. So to this end, at the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy, we partnered with the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's disease to explore these issues and provide a framework for developing practical policy approaches to addressing them. And today, in particular, we're going to be discussing an issue brief that we've developed on the topic of payment access and next steps for evidence generation. We'll also talk about what we see as the priority next steps in this space more broadly. After that presentation, we'll hear the reactions from several key stakeholders, and we'll open up for time for questions from those of you who are with us today. And again, thank you for joining us on this important emerging topic. Just to note, at this point, everyone in the webinar has been placed on mute. If you have a question or comment during the webinar, you can send it to us at any time. Please use the private chat function on the webinar to send the private chat to the webinar host, Monica Schneider. You can do that just by clicking on the chat bubble at the bottom of your webinar screen. And again, we'll have some time for going through these questions and comments towards the end of our presentations today. Right now, though, I'd like to turn to Drew Holzapfel, who is the Executive Director of the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's Disease, for some brief opening comments. Drew, thanks very much for being with us today.
Well, thanks so much, Mark. And I just want to check and see if I am a stand-in for George Brandenburg, who's the convener of the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's Disease. He might have landed on time. George, are you on and able to speak? So I will go ahead and just give brief opening remarks. And Mark, I think everything you said we agree with 100%. And thank you for lending your important voice to this effort. CEOI is proud to work with Duke to support this endeavor. So as Mark mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's Disease. It's CEOI for short. We're a patient-led private sector coalition that represents pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, financial companies, and care delivery companies. And as we turn it over to Monica, and what you'll hear from the Duke team today is reflective of one of our commitments as a coalition, and that's to ensure access to future innovative treatments and diagnostics as well as they come to market. This is a key piece of our work, and as we focus on driving healthcare system readiness. And access to treatment is just one of those pieces, as is access to infrastructure that will be required for these treatments and diagnostics. Access to trained providers and specialists is another key piece. And the bottom line for us is our point of view is that we are not ready. The healthcare system is not ready. Not here in the U.S., but also almost no country across the globe is ready. And as Mark pointed to, we're running out of time for all the good reasons. The pipeline of treatments is getting closer to bearing fruit. So 15 years without novel treatment, it's a long time. And our fear is that we, as a stakeholder community, are stuck in slow motion. And we're about to be tested. So as we move forward, we need a sense of urgency, and we need to apply what we hear today by working together. So again, Mark, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Drew. We very much appreciate the collaboration and the commitment you have to working out an effective path forward in this really important space and challenging one as well. So we're going to get going right into the content of the issue brief and the further discussion. For that, we'll be led by Monica Schneider, who's a managing associate here at the Duke-Margolis Center, who focuses on issues with access to new technologies like this important area. She's going to provide an overview of the issue brief and our collaboration with CEOI. Monica, please go ahead.
Great, thanks, Mark, and also thanks, Drew. Before getting into the actual content of the issue brief, just give some brief background on our project. So since 2017, Duke Margolis has been collaborating with the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's disease. And what we've done in the past is to facilitate input from a diverse group of stakeholders, including pharma, physicians, payers, government, and academics, through the convening of expert workshops and through conducting stakeholder interviews. So through these multi-stakeholder meetings and conversations, we've been working to address key challenges and to propose practical policy strategies. So some of our previous work is focused on identifying treatment issues in current clinical practice, exploring strategies to improve the diagnosis and screening of Alzheimer's disease, and discussing how to leverage data and evidence to assess the value of these Alzheimer's disease therapies. In our most recent work, we've been focused on understanding the type of payment approaches that might be used for future Alzheimer's drugs, specifically focusing on treatments that modify the course of disease and that are intended to treat patients who are in the very early stages of disease. These new disease-modifying drugs could bring significant changes to how AD is treated and have the potential to bring significant changes for patient outcomes over time. Yet, drugs that target early-stage Alzheimer's disease raise concerns about high upfront and chronic treatment costs, especially since it would be unclear whether those additional costs will translate to real-world benefits. The value that these drugs bring to patients may not be immediately apparent because of the long time horizon of Alzheimer's disease progression and because of the variability of progression among patients. So payment reform approaches are appealing because they offer an opportunity to improve the understanding of how the drug in question works over time through enhanced data collection and can potentially result in lower payments for a drug if it does not work as expected. So to further explore these issues, earlier in 2019, Duke Margolis held a closed expert workshop to discuss how payment reform could enhance the access to and understanding of these new drugs, as well as discuss areas where improved tracking and outcomes could lead to better coverage decisions. Following this expert workshop, Duke Margolis developed an issue brief, which is going to be presented here, to capture the critical discussion points, which included describing potential therapies and their expected impact on patient outcomes, exploring what types of payment models might be well suited for reimbursement of these types of therapies, and understanding what might be the needed next steps to prepare for anticipated treatments and for the implementation of different types of payment models. So we hope that this issue brief can start more conversations around this issue, because with the number of people impacted by this disease, it will be critical to get the issue of payment and access right, as close to market entry as possible. So there are three main sections of the issue brief that I will walk through. And the first section of the issue brief addresses the potential screening process for access to therapeutics, including discussion on what might be considered as potential risk factors for disease. So the figure on the right depicts a potential pathway for screening patients for how to get access for new types of drugs. And this can involve a number of different tests and risk factors. So here it's just an example of what we see as a potential way to go through, and depending on the physician and the practice, it could be variable. So as blood-based biomarker tests and other types of diagnostics advance, this type of screening might be somewhat simplified. But under current screening procedures, a PET scan or a CSF draw for amyloid beta screening might be the final step prior to prescribing a new drug. And then the indicated population can also be variable, and we won't know exactly what this is until a drug is actually approved. But we tried to describe the likely patient populations that would qualify for new types of treatments, covering those who have mild symptoms as well as those who would be pre-symptomatic. So within the issue brief, we provide some generalizations about the age range, cognitive scores, and healthcare screening behaviors, and consider the conditions that might restrict treatment to this access, as well as try to understand who might be the ones who would receive first access. So within the second part of the issue brief, and as we mentioned earlier, we tried to discuss some of the payment models that could be used to mitigate financial risk, as well as to help physicians and payers understand who might be the best for access or who might be appropriately using these therapies at first. So uncertainties about how the drug may function in the real world could lead to challenges for payers in providing coverage and reimbursement of drugs because of uncertain benefits and potentially high costs. So there will likely be questions about whether benefits to patients and the benefits in reallocating budgets will be realized in these heterogeneous real-world populations. And traditional payment models, which are generally fee-for-service basis, so payment based on the volume used, may limit coverage and access, may reduce opportunities to learn about the drug after approval because there's no link to performance of the drug in the real world. In contrast, we think that reimbursement linked to available and emerging evidence patient groups might help to address some of these uncertainties. So reforming payment methods could encourage evaluation of real-world patient outcomes, enabling broader access to patients as additional information is learned. It could also help to mitigate some of the financial uncertainties that are associated with payment and with value. So while adjusting how we pay for future drugs might not necessarily solve the issues around there being substantial costs associated with treating Alzheimer's disease patients, but it could help us to link payment to the actual value that is provided to bring greater value to the treatment process in general. So within the issue brief, we go into a bit more detail about the potential types of payment models and how they might be applied. So one thing that has been clear in our conversations with stakeholders and that we're trying to get across in the issue brief is that payers and manufacturers should continue to have flexibility in their approaches to payment. And at this point, we're not recommending any one type of model over another. However, we do want to introduce these concepts and help people to think through what might work for their situations. So the table here provides a brief outline of a few different types of models, and I'm just going to walk through these briefly. Value-adjusted evidence-based pricing might be thought of similarly to indication-based pricing in that the initial price would be based on existing evidence, such as clinical trial data. But in this type of model, the price could potentially be adjusted as more is learned about the drug and payers and providers gain more experience with its use. Potentially, this model would require less infrastructure and could be relatively less complicated to model, though there could be more administrative burden as well as creating a perception problem if there are different prices associated with different populations. In the next type of model, coverage with evidence development, this type of payment model has been used in the past for other types of drugs and devices, and it is where coverage and payment for a drug is linked to further evidence development around an unresolved question around efficacy or safety, something like that. One of the advantages of this type of model is that it may reduce the financial risk for payers while enabling greater access for patients. In the next two payment models, we're shifting a bit from basing the payment based on evidence that's available to basing payment around evidence that's generated over time. So outcomes-based payment links payment for a product to its actual performance in a patient or a population. And in this type of model, the final payment might be based on evidence collected over time, and this could be done through potentially rebates if a specified outcome is not met. And this type of model could also encourage continued evidence generation while maintaining accountability for the impacts of the drug. A step further from this type of model is a population-based payment or subscription payment, which is meant to provide a predictable access to our product in exchange for a recurring payment that could be linked to all outcomes. So potentially, this type of model would allow for broader access to your product at a lower price, and payments could be adjusted over time, but would also require significant data infrastructure to track and collect outcomes and information over time. Which gets us to what are some of the challenges that we might encounter with these payment models. So the ability to track outcomes over time represents one of the biggest hurdles to actual implementation. And in addition, for Alzheimer's disease specifically, the time horizon for disease progression is so long that it could raise questions about the ability to continuously collect data. And it could also raise some questions about data portability if a patient switches between providers or payers. So another challenge to implementation would be developing consensus around outcomes and the measures that could be used to evaluate those outcomes, because these might vary by stakeholders. Particularly, and it could also be difficult to incorporate some of the patient outcome preferences as well. So these types of issues feed into larger questions about how it might be best to implement better systems for tracking and data collection. So, and this gets us to the third section of our issue brief, which is around development of facilitating payment through improved use of data and data collection. So development and widespread use of a data platform or some sort of system to better collect data could better capture outcomes and data sources. And the types of data sources can be variable and would likely depend on the type of outcome measures that are important, but could include cognitive screening and biomarker test results, comprehensive notes from provider visits, healthcare utilization metrics, and patient and caregiver reported outcomes. However, this type of information is not only needed for tracking outcomes of drug use, but is also important information that could improve diagnosis and interactions between physicians and patients in primary care. So better data collection could potentially help with earlier diagnoses and enable better baseline data on cognitive function, which could be really important for drugs that are intended to treat patients at much earlier stages of disease. So our current systems do not necessarily have the capacity for this kind of data collection currently, and it's possible that EHR systems may need to be modified to accommodate new types of data and its collection. So from this conversation and this work, and considering all of these topics so far, we think there are some pretty clear next steps for where this work can go and where stakeholders should start to think about payment and access to these drugs. So one is around better understanding the evidentiary needs of payers to make coverage decisions, as well as a better understanding of what the desired outcomes are. What would make use of valuable therapy to both payers and to patients? And once we understand these characteristics, we can start to think about what components and different types of payment models might be best suited to deliver on those results. Another area for next steps is around the data collection itself. What type of data and data systems are needed to obtain the outcomes and information that stakeholders find most valuable? So this type of extensive data collection will also need to integrate with the clinical process. Further, the data needs might change as the disease progresses, and it would be beneficial to understand the desired outcomes and information needed at each stage. And so that concludes for me, and I will turn it back over to Mark.
Thanks very much for the overview, Monica. And just a reminder for those of you who have not already seen the issue brief, it was distributed with the registration information yesterday, and it is also now available on the Duke Margolis website. I'd like to turn now to reactions from two perspectives. First, we'll hear from Phyllis Barkman-Farrell, who's Global Head of External Engagement in Alzheimer's disease and neurodegeneration at Lilly Biomedicines, which is part of Eli Lilly and Company. Then we'll hear from Lydia Lonman, who's a Senior Global Policy Access Leader in the Global Access Policy at Hoffman LaRoche. So first, we're going to turn to Phyllis. And Phyllis, I hope you're off mute and can please go ahead at this point.
Hi, Mark. Thanks. I think I'm off mute. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, great.
Good. Okay. Well, a big thank you to you and Monica and everybody at the Institute for tackling this this challenge. It's certainly one that needed some good thought. And the work you've done is quite good. We agree wholeheartedly that our healthcare systems are woefully unprepared for the future, but honestly, they're also not doing a great job today for individuals that are experiencing symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Lilly's done quite a bit of clinical trial recruiting over the last 30 years, and the example that I often share is that there's 5 million people with this disease, and it still took us 18 months to find 1,000. That doesn't make sense, and it's largely because we have a multifaceted issue in front of us that impacts all parts of the system. And ultimately, that means that patients aren't flowing through our healthcare systems productively, which means they're not getting the best care, but it also means that as healthcare systems, we can't take care of them in the most efficient manner once we do have treatments available. You guys did a great job of identifying that there's no system-friendly way of finding these patients early in the disease. right now, the mental orientation of Alzheimer's disease is quite late. If you talk with someone of Alzheimer's disease, they think of a little old lady in a rocking chair in the corner of a nursing home. And what we know is that actually amyloid builds 20 years in the brain before symptoms start. So really the ability to catch this disease early, not even just before symptoms, but even early in the symptoms, to make sure that patients and their families are getting all the support they need is really, really important. You talked about the scientific barriers around biomarkers. I think that's really clear, and it's something we all need to work on, and we'll come back to here. But the barriers are not solely scientific. If patients and their physicians are not talking about brain health at every visit, then we'll never really tackle the problem in front of us. You know, one of the things that we're concerned about, and I like your approach here in the paper, is that key decision makers seem to make the case that none of these changes need to happen until we actually have a therapy, and that once we have a therapy, miraculously, all the systems will align. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for 25 years, and I can confirm that our healthcare system does not change quickly, and especially here in the U.S., where we have fragmentation of decision making and we have independent technology systems at different healthcare organizations. It can take years for data and information to flow, get algorithms aligned, et cetera. And with 10 years as a professional in Alzheimer's disease and caring for my father, I can tell you that it is a really, really painful process to navigate that healthcare system today. It's lonely, it's hard to find resources, and honestly, I don't know how someone might do it in this country who doesn't have, you know, the means or at least the education to really dig in. We wholeheartedly support at Lilly value-based agreements. Love that you guys identified several different types. We believe that value-based agreements align in spirit with a healthcare system that rewards innovation. But you nailed it when you said that outcomes-based contracts depend on an ability to measure outcomes. And in the case of Alzheimer's disease, if you're talking about a disease-modifying therapy, this becomes incredibly challenging because you're actually slowing progression. And progression is a relative term. It's highly variable across individuals. It's very difficult to identify what the progression might have been, and that would be necessary in an outcomes-based agreement. So that brings you back to biomarkers. You know, an objective way of measuring a response to therapy that we don't have today. And sadly, our current market environment does not encourage, support, or even drive innovation in biomarkers. So I believe we're going to need some sort of market imperfection, or we're just not going to see success quickly enough. So just to say thank you to the organizers again, we wholly support what you're working on. And what I would encourage and ask is that as part of the outcome of this project, we encourage people to begin making changes now. Let's not wait for a therapy to hit. If we begin making changes now, we know that more patients can benefit today from the tools and resources available. They can consider clinical research if it's something they'd like to participate in, and it'll allow us to lay the foundation for the future. Our brain is our fifth vital sign, and it needs to be checked at regular intervals with consistent methodology. We've had multiple groups tackle consensus projects on which data and which test and which tool. We just need to make a decision and move. And we need to tackle education of the frontline HCPs as well as the public. And then lastly, we've got to fix the market dynamic to encourage innovation and commercialization in diagnostics. If the market environment's not going to drive that in the private sector, then somebody in the public sector is going to have to come up with a non-market driven solution to do so. So I love the work here, and I think, you know, sadly, it's probably just the start of what we need to do in the U.S. healthcare system, but really pleased to have been able to react and play a small part in it.
Well, thank you very much, Phyllis, both for the thoughtful comments on not only the need to plan ahead, but some specific approaches and priorities for doing so, as well as bringing that additional perspective from actually being an Alzheimer's caregiver. Thank you. Next, I'd like to turn to Lydia, who's going to provide an international perspective on some of these issues. Lydia, welcome, and I hope you're off mute. And I don't think you're off mute yet.
Hello?
There you go.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Great. I think I just hit the wrong button. So thank you to the Duke and COI teams for the opportunity to kind of provide a global or international perspective. You know, what the findings in your brief are not isolated to the US. We're seeing the similar challenges across all markets in terms of health system readiness, particularly as we're looking at, you know, on the verge, hopefully, of bringing a DMT to market. What we're seeing is really the science is advancing at a pace that's far faster than healthcare systems can transform to meet these new and emerging needs, new technologies, both in medicines and diagnostics. You know, I spent my early career advising different ministers of health on how to design healthcare systems. And I can tell you firsthand that these things don't happen within an election cycle. They take decades. And I think, you know, similar to what Phyllis had said, that the time to act is now. You can't wait for a DMT and then the healthcare system to magically transform. We at Roche, we believe that it's actually the time to act now, is to really look at what are some of those system changes that can be done to ensure that patients are getting, that they're detecting disease, that they're able to diagnose a disease, they're able to receive the treatment when one's available, and then monitor how their disease is progressing. So today I just wanted to have a chance to talk about some of the work that we're doing in Europe, similar to the work that's being done by COI and Duke related to healthcare system value assessment and funding and financing in the Alzheimer's disease space. You can go to the second slide. So it's a group called Project Alzheimer's Value Europe. PAVE was convened at our inaugural meeting in November of 2019. Meeting attendees represent stakeholders committed to Alzheimer's disease research, value assessment, and funding to really look at the foundational work that was started by the Pathways for the Introduction of Alzheimer's Disease Treatment, or PIAD. I know that PIAD had joined a 2019 Duke COI meeting, so some of you may be familiar with them. But just as a reminder, PIAD was formed in 2018 to address these unique valuation and funding challenges faced by Alzheimer's disease in Europe, with the aim to identify the barriers and then also potential solutions to enhance health technology assessment models. So the PIAD work really serves as a foundational piece for PAVE, which is a multi-stakeholder forum to continue the work around assessment and funding of emerging Alzheimer's therapies and diagnostics. At our inaugural meeting, PAVE members agreed that there is really a demand and opportunity to continue to be thought partners in these kinds of deliberations and efforts. And I think this potential, the timing couldn't be better, and that we could see a DMT on the market. So there's quite a bit of urgency, similar to the remarks earlier. As the slide states, our work will focus on largely two areas. So really educating policymakers, payers, and other stakeholders in key European countries on the current challenges related to assessing the value of Alzheimer's disease, and to work together alongside with these payers and policymakers to develop real-world solutions that allow you to both assess the value of new disease and innovation, as well as look at different funding and financing models for these therapeutics and diagnostics. The next slide. So there's four main projects that PAVE will focus on this year. One is looking at really driving the use of registries. All PAVE members agreed that there are a number of registries, there's great information, but what are some common elements that are being collected? And I think the idea was that if you can have a number of kind of core components of data that's being collected, it allows you to actually utilize these registries in a much more effective way to understand the disease, to understand how patients are progressing between different disease states, and how they're actually benefiting from therapy. There's all these kind of secondary piece of work around addressing payment and access. And really this is looking at, can we kind of look at new funding financing models, particularly for therapies that could be provided 10 or 15 years prior to symptom onset, There could be some uncertainty, particularly given the lack of natural history data. So again, this is looking at some innovative funding and financing solutions similar to the ones that you identified in this most recent brief. The third component is really looking at what are the core elements for measurement. So are we thinking about what are the key pieces within health technology assessment that are fundamental to assessing the value of new AD interventions? And the last piece is really, I think, fundamental. And the group spent quite a bit of time talking about the need for a really good EPI model. There's a lack of clinical consensus in terms of what the disease states themselves, how patients move in between the different stages of Alzheimer's disease, and what that then means for being able to either assess a new intervention and provide a value assessment. Go to the next slide. So this includes just a number of the PAVE members. You'll probably see some names that you recognize ranging from industry to government to academia to clinical leaders. And then you'll see the next slide, please. There's a website, paveeurope.com, where you can find background information, including the recent meeting reports, full summary of the discussions of the group. And if there's any questions, reach out to me directly or via info@paveeurope.com. Our hope is that, we feel like this work of PAVE actually naturally links with the Duke COI work, and COI is also involved in PAVE, so we feel that there'll be a great bridge to help kind of inform the work of each group.
Great. Lydia, thank you very much for that presentation of the important work that's going on in Europe. We really appreciate the perspective, and as you pointed out, a lot of common ground. So we do have some time for questions now. We've gotten some in already. Remember, use the chat button to send a private chat to our host, Monica Schneider, and we'll try to get to as many of these as possible in the time we have left. And remember, if you haven't been able to get the issue brief already and would like it, that's available on our website at our Duke Margolis website. First question, and I think a couple of questions have come up along these lines, have to do with not the nature of the price for such a new early stage Alzheimer's treatment, but the level of the price. The question, just to summarize, asks about what the price level people might think should be expected for a treatment, and how that price level affects the overall approach of who is going to pay and when, and how important some of these alternative pricing mechanisms might be. One of our submitters from Amypor noted that they're envisioning a price that may be significantly less than some other products that have been speculated on in the market. So we don't have any products yet, so it's probably hard to decide to speculate about exact pricing, but would appreciate any comments from our panelists about thoughts on pricing levels and how that affects the pricing mechanisms that might be used. Certainly might affect the concerns for payers. So any comments?
I'm happy to start, and this is Phyllis, and then Lydia might want to build on this. So what I can tell you at Lilly is that, and I think in general in pharma, we actually don't do price setting until we have the data in hand. And it's for the same reason that you guys brought up things like value-based arrangements. We believe that the products ought to be priced toward the value that they're going to create. And, until you actually have that data in hand, it's going to be difficult to determine. There's also a wide range of potential prices depending on what type of molecule you're talking about. Obviously, a small molecule versus a biotech product, products that are dosed daily versus monthly, products that, might be a preventative product versus, say, a short-term symptomatic. So I think it's very difficult to make a call even kind of on the level of price. What I think is important is that we're able to have a conversation about what kind of value the product creates. You're able to then associate that value in what you're talking about, like an outcomes-based contract, something along those lines. And then, quite honestly, I think where it impacts the level a lot is the cost of the diagnostic. So for example, people are frustrated with the cost of nuclear radiopharmaceuticals, and specifically tracers that are used to diagnose or in the diagnostic process. They're very expensive products to make. They are extremely difficult to make and to deliver, and yet they could deliver with quite clarity whether someone doesn't have amyloid, and that would be a really important thing to know, for example, if you were going to dose an anti-amyloid drug. So I think the other part is when you think of the price, you've got to think about what other things that go along with it, getting the accurate diagnostic, making sure that the procedures are covered. In a lot of cases, if these are infusions, there's another part to the cost. What kind of cost does it offset in the healthcare system, and really looking at it holistically as to how does it drive value.
And Mark, it's Lydia.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, Lydia, please go ahead.
Similar to Phyllis, it's really difficult to kind of elucidate or even kind of predict what a price would be in absence of clinical data. And so I think generally most companies price look at pricing as a reflection of the value that medicine, that innovation, that diagnostic can bring not only to the patient, to the healthcare system, to caregivers, to the broader society, to the economy. And so, with this said, I think there's kind of multiple components of value. So, value and price should be connected. Also, there needs to be incentives for further innovation, particularly in challenging spaces such as Alzheimer's disease or neuroscience. But yeah, I think, we need to have a kind of this broader discussion around value. And in AD, this is even more challenging because currently, if you were to bring a disease-modifying therapy to market, a lot of that value is actually accrued outside of the healthcare system. And so you're having then potentially a payer who's not accruing the value, the true kind of broader value of that drug. So again, this is why I think we have to have these conversations around how do you assess the value of a new therapy, particularly when it could be provided very early in disease and for a long time, or in a disease area where a lot of that care is currently being provided outside of the healthcare system. So these I think this is why it's very challenging to have these discussions around value assessment and funding and financing in AD.
Yeah, and I think those both highlight the value. While we don't know those questions about exact value ahead of time, it's the value of having these kinds of plans for how best to consider all these important dimensions that relate to pricing. And Monica, just to go back to some of the points from your presentation, I guess it also matters not just the price level, but the extent to which there's certainty or agreement about some of these dimensions of benefits, longer term outcomes, effects that may differ across groups, where certainly there's some relevant, highly relevant evidence at the time a product is approved, but maybe a lot more to learn after approval too. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that is one of the main questions is whether or not what the price or what value assessments are used to set the price will actually end up coming to fruition once the patient has been on the treatment for a period of time. So we certainly have thought about what models might be used to help both the patient and the payer ensure this. So for example, the value-adjusted evidence-based pricing, you might consider subpopulations or certain type of patients who may be more likely to benefit versus those who may be less likely to benefit. and adjust the payments based on those characteristics, at least at the beginning, until some of the data and evidence start to come in. Or if we wanted to consider value kind of in real time over a longer course of time, perhaps 1 to 3 years, we might think about something like the outcomes-based payment, where the price is set at the beginning, but then the manufacturer might be accountable for how well the drug performs in the patient or the population. And if that value that they initially set or thought that the drug would provide doesn't end up meeting some specified outcomes, then that would be credited back to the payer and potentially the patient in order to reflect what the outcomes actually were.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for those perspectives. And actually, the next question I wanted to get to from our webinar participants is related to the topic you just brought up. It's a question about the issue of variable pricing based on characteristics of a patient. So the questioner asks, gives an example of a patient who has comorbidities such as the diabetes that might lead to higher costs associated with the diabetes on the medical side from having Alzheimer's. I think you maybe take this question even more broadly to note that the Alzheimer's population and the risk for Alzheimer's are heterogeneous. Progression rates may differ. It's possible that responsiveness to treatment may differ across these groups. And so the question is about how feasible are these variable prices, as Monica was just describing as one possibility, higher for certain kinds of indications, lower for others. And that is covered in the issue brief, along with a note about some of the administrative challenges of setting up differential pricing, and maybe also some perception challenges related to that. We haven't seen a lot of sort of direct differential pricing implemented to date. So maybe back to our panelists, Phyllis, Lydia, any thoughts on this question?
I haven't put a ton of.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Lydia.
Yeah, it's hard to comment on that in this space, just because I don't think we've had the opportunity to have something come to market. But we do see kind of new, innovative pricing models, whether that be based on value-based healthcare, pay for performance, differential pricing being tested and tried in other therapeutic areas. So again, I think this really depends on the drug in question or the innovation in question, the market dynamics. How do you address? I think affordability is variable as well. So I think it's really about kind of working together with kind of a local payer and understanding of the kind of the uniqueness of that environment and their realities to kind of work together to design a solution that helps provide access to new innovation. So it's not kind of a one size fits all approach. It's not to say this model is the best, or we're only going to market with this model. I think in the new environment, you have to be flexible. And again, the whole idea is to work in partnership with a payer to determine a way forward to facilitate that access.
And Lydia, comments from you?
That was Lydia.
That was actually.
I'm sorry,
Lydia.
My mistake, Phyllis. I'm not sure. I'm sorry, Phyllis. I thought you'd want to. Did you want to add something or?
No, Lydia nailed it. I haven't spent enough time thinking about differential by patient. I think affordability is something we have tackled. We have done differential pricing by dose, but what we find is someone in the healthcare system will work their way through that anyway. So I think that's a little bit of the trouble with the differential pricing is you're going to have to do some kind of ethics modeling to see, are you going to actually disadvantage somebody in a differential pricing situation?
Yeah. So another question back to one of the themes in your comments and in the issue brief as well around the need not just for having a clear framework and a approach, hopefully with broad-based agreement to how pricing might work, both the levels and whether the alternative payment models would really help given the special circumstances in this case, in this type of treatment development, but also the significant impacts on the care delivery system. You all alluded to the potentially significant costs associated with screening patients and getting them onto treatment, as well as costs if biomarkers are going to be used. Those may have some cost and burden of collection as well. If all, say, are related to imaging, those costs could be quite significant. And we have a health system, in addition to that, that's really not well set up, as you all pointed out, to manage patients with risk of Alzheimer's or early Alzheimer's in a coordinated, longitudinal way that really tries to support interception and impact on the progression of disease. That kind of longitudinal care model with efficient imaging seems like something that would be really helpful to develop for a condition like this, but we're not there now. There's a lot of variation, for example, in the cost of PET scanning, depending on where you get it done and how, and on coordinating information from imaging with the ongoing management of Alzheimer's as a chronic modifiable disease. Have your companies done any kind of initial work on pushing towards a new care model, and is that something where the drug developers could have a significant role to play? Since, as you all said, we're clearly not there now.
It's Phyllis, Mark, and so I think there's two different things there's a lot of things packed into that question.
Yeah.
Around a new care model, the answer is absolutely. We've thought a lot about it. It's one of the reasons that we're so active in this space, and that can start with something as simple as making sure that the annual Medicare wellness visit happens, and there's a true assessment of cognition at that visit. That's not a PET scan. I mean, that's actually just doing what we should be doing. I mean, it's supposed to be being done now, and it's not. So I think we have to be careful not to make the problem so big that it scares us and we choke on it, because some of the things really aren't that. I mean, they may not be easy, but they're simple. And so I think that's number one when you think about a care model. And then I think, of course, there's things that we should be doing for caregivers on the back end. This disease breaks families financially because we have not thought through the policy implications of our country depending on a social structure to provide care rather than the healthcare system. And I specifically feel strongly about this because women are more likely to be caregivers 4-to-1 over men, which means all the progress that we've made in gender diversity in the workforce will essentially go away come the baby boomers having all aged into this disease. But I think if you ask specifically the question about biomarkers, it comes back to the point I made that, if you're going to want to use a PET scan more regularly than, say, just a baseline, you could argue whether scientifically that makes sense or not. But certainly whether it be a PET scan or a blood biomarker, or even some of these digital cognitive tests, we have to have a market that encourages people to innovate there. Because what you're talking about is not what those tools are actually indicated for right now, which means you will need additional studies and additional registration work with the diagnostic division of the FDA. Those are things that cost a lot of money. And today you can't recoup of that on the back end. And so, all of those things sound wonderful, but if we don't have a market that actually encourages people to innovate with those types of tools, you're either going to have to do it for the private sector. The public sector is just going to have to say they're just going to do it, or you're going to have to make some changes so that the private sector makes the choice to innovate in that way.
Yeah, Lydia, does the outlook in this area look any different in Europe?
Well, I think for us, we cover the entire world, and at Roche, we both, not just in pharmaceuticals, but also diagnostics. And I think within the space, this is where we've seen a lot of the innovation happen. So where we've had some, challenges in terms of identifying a right target for a drug, we've actually seen a lot of innovation and improvement in the kind of the diagnostic and screening tools available for Alzheimer's disease. And so I think we are starting to develop kind of tools and evidence to help inform the most effective use of screening diagnostic tools and ensuring that, they can be integrated within the healthcare system pathway at the appropriate time and at the appropriate place. So I think part of it is in these new care models, we have to look at how the care is delivered, where and when it's delivered, and by whom. And I think kind of what we've seen currently in terms of the patient pathway is it's taking a long time to get in to see a primary care physician, that the primary care physician typically is unable or unwilling by a variety of reasons to run a cognitive assessment, whether it's an MMSE or a MOCA, and that there's doing a lot of referrals into an AD specialist. And this is where things are getting clogged up. And so I think we're not going to have, a fundamental shift, a healthcare system transformation in terms of how AD is treated, diagnosed, and monitored overnight. But I do agree with Phyllis, is there are some real live things that can be done today to really set up and smooth out that patient pathway so that a patient does receive a screen, that they do have access to a diagnostic test in a reasonable amount of time, and that if they are eligible for treatment, they can get treatment and be monitored. Again, it's not going to kind of happen overnight, but I think there's a lot of work that both kind of industry, manufacturers, as well as governments, payers, those that are designing healthcare systems can do together to really design something that can work not only today, but also into the future.
Great. Thanks very much, Lydia. And Phyllis, thank you as well for your comments with us today. I'd like to turn first to Monica to see if we're about out of time, see if, Monica, any final thoughts or points you'd like to make before we wrap up this discussion?
No final points here, except to really appreciate everybody who has been able to join the webinar today, as well as appreciate Lydia and Phyllis sharing their reactions and their thoughts with us on this important topic.
Yeah, and Drew, any final comments from you on behalf of CEOI?
Yes, thanks, Mark. Really appreciate this discussion. It was excellent. I thought it opened up a great discussion about the healthcare system readiness issue that we care so deeply about. Great job by Phyllis and Lydia, and we're proud to have them and their companies as members in CEOI. Just real quickly, I thought a couple of points just to reflect on. The biomarkers discussion I thought was really important. And I think the key piece that Phyllis hit on is their limited commercial incentives. And so I think that needs to be addressed, and I think it can be addressed in some type of pre-competitive collaboration. Another issue with biomarkers is just finding a way to get reproducibility of the results. It's really from lab to lab, it's highly variable. I think that's slowing us down. I think that there's a quick, one of the ideas around how we can get better view into the highly variable disease. We'd like to see these large standing cohorts that are around the world be utilized and add cognitive screening to the cohorts. There's one in the U.S. called All of Us, and seems like it could be a nice platform. So we'd like to pursue that. I would like to say on the coverage with evidence decision as a model, we're a patient-driven coalition driven by a sense of urgency, and what we've seen with CEDs is that it really slows solutions to a patient, and even when the work is done and comes back to show a positive benefit to patients, that has not been motivating to payers. So I would caution us about that model. And then finally, I think we need more of these discussions. So I'll give a shameless plug. CEOI and OECD annually host these types of discussions. Mark, you've been there, Monica, as well. And so this is always referred to as Lausanne, and Lausanne 7, our 7th year, is being held December 2nd and 3rd in Lausanne, Switzerland. So We'll be doing work on this between now and then, but I hope everybody marks their calendars for that meeting. It's really important to us. Back to you, Mark.
Great, Drew. Thanks for those comments. And clearly, a lot that we've talked about today. And again, if you haven't had a chance to access the issue brief, it's on our website now at Duke Margolis. And so while we've accomplished a lot, clearly a lot ahead. So this is definitely not the last word on this topic, but I think we do have a clear understanding both of the importance of addressing these issues before products come to market in this space. We've seen some examples where new treatments, even though they've been in development for some time, hit the market, and there's just not a good, smooth process forward for access and sustainability and a more efficient healthcare system as a result. So we'll keep working to try to address these issues ahead of time, and I hope you all will stay in touch with us about this topic and other important ones at Duke Margolis. So just to close, I'd like to thank COI again for their funding and support for this work and their partnership on this ongoing effort. And I also want to thank our panelists for their time with us today and their thoughtful insights as we do try to move forward, and especially all of you who joined us on the webinar today. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions or comments about our work here. And if you're not signed up with Duke Margolis for our regular updates and newsletters, please do so as well. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of the day today.